So we know the Bible is full of esoteric knowledge, as I talk about. But when you study Sumerian history, the question you ask yourself is, how is it that the Sumerians can be, so old? The history could be so old. How is it we don't find the Sumerians in the Bible? How is it the Bible is not talking about the ancient Sumerians? So I know people are going to say, isn't it talking about the Sumerians in the book of Genesis, chapter 11, when it's talking about the land of Shinar? And Shinar translates into Babel, which, Babylon. So one of the things I like to do when we get words like this is always go back to Codex Sinaiticus, because you want to try to establish if it's really talking about the Sumerians or the Babylonians. And we know, it's the Tower of Babel. So even when you go to Codex Sinaiticus, we only get, it's supposed to be like 8 different translations or 8 times that Shinar is mentioned in the Bible. We only really see it once in Codex Sinaiticus, and it's not saying the same thing as it says in Isaiah 11:11. You go to Isaiah 11:11 in the Codex Sinaiticus, and we do find it there, and we find the word as you can see here, which supposedly translates into Babel, meaning Babylon, which we know Babel means, it means speech. So when you go into the other verses, which Genesis is supposed to be mentioned, also in the book of Daniel, which is not in Codex Sinaiticus, by the way. Zecharia, we go there and we can see here where it's supposed to be. You don't see that same word in Zecharia, so it's not there where it's supposed to be. Also supposed to be mentioned in the book of Joshua, and it's not there when you look in Codex Sinaiticus. So we got to understand, as I always say, Sinaiticus, which is the oldest complete biblical manuscript written in Greek, it's not the same as the King James Version. This stuff was changed for a reason. Now, this is important because we have to establish, one, they're telling us that this book, the Bible, is old. It's giving us the recorded history from start to finish. How is it not mentioning the Sumerians? And we understand why it's not mentioning the Sumerians, because the Sumerian civilization wasn't discovered until the mid-19th century. We're talking about the 1850s. After 1850 is when they first discovered the Sumerian civilization, which we know, of course, the powers that be already knew. Now it says here, the ancient Sumerians, the black-headed ones, lived in the southern part of what is now Iraq. The heartland of Sumer lay between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers and what the Greeks later called Mesopotamia. This territory, once skillfully irrigated, proved very fertile, and major cities had long been in existence before the period when archaeologists can identify the Sumerian people themselves. The Sumerians were characteristically inventive and are likely to have been responsible for the development of the first writing well before 3000 BCE. Sumerians were recording their language using simple pictures. They wrote on tablets of clay, later evolving the script that to us is known as cuneiform or wedge-shaped. Now, real quick, one of the things I get into, I always talk about Ethiopians, just talk about, the whole out of Africa thing. You got to remember, like I said, when these people basically came from out of hiding, it's something had happened. And we have this whole migration that's supposed to have taken place. Whatever that was, as I said, the civilization that followed the Nile up to Egypt, when they got there, those pyramids was there. Just that simple. Khufu, Khafre, Menkaure was there. Great Pyramids was already there. But you had a time frame where people was doing expeditions to the Middle East to try to validate the Bible. And for a long time they was going there. We know these expeditions was taking years. And they find stuff and they got to excavate that take even more years, especially so long ago. But a lot of people don't understand. It was a whole time where they were going out to try to validate the Bible. People was, obsessed with it to go out in history and find these places to try to validate the book. And they went out and they, this is when we start uncovering everything. This is where you have Champollion and all these French archaeologists and researchers or what have you going out trying to validate religion. Now you've seen in the video, it's talking about Jupiter, talking about what happened, this whole collision and everything like that. So this is important to understand, maintain that information. So biggest part, we got to understand, where did this stuff come from? Because a lot of people have this idea that what we've been told about the Sumerians and the whole story about Enki and Enlil, everything about the Sumerian tablets and all this information about the Anunnaki is just this really ancient information that's been around for a long time. And it's because the Sumerian, civilization is so old, people just automatically couple the two, not realizing what they're saying and what's going on and what's been put out about this information. And you have to understand, it's one man, Zecharia Sitchin, that 1979, he came out with his book, and he's the one who put out all this information. But it's all him. And the more you dig into it, the more you figure out exactly what happened. But it's real easy to see, who this guy is. I know you guys already know about Masonry and everything like that, and who he's affiliated with in the story, but people don't know how deep this is. Now, this is a thing that has almost gotten out of hand, and it's like no mediator there to step up and be like, hey, y'all need to stop dealing with this shit because this is the truth. This is what's happening, because a lot of people is so fixated on the story and it sounds so believable, but they don't understand how they're coupling Sitchin's story with the truth, and they don't go together. You're coupling what Sitchin put out with the information they found on the Sumerians, and it's just not the same. It's two totally different stories. His story is completely fabricated. So you got to understand, it's Sitchin. It's his story that a lot of you guys are believing that is at the forefront of this Anunnaki stuff. So here it says, just real quick, easy. When you go to his Wikipedia, it says Zecharia Sitchin was an author of a number of books proposing an explanation for human origins involving ancient astronauts. Sitchin attributed the creation of the ancient Sumerian culture to the Anunnaki, which he stated was a race of extraterrestrials from a planet beyond Neptune called Nibiru. Okay? It says here, Sitchin's ideas have been resoundingly rejected by scientists, academics, historians, including Sumerianologists, Orientalists, and Assyrianologists, and anthropologists, who dismiss his work as pseudoscience and pseudohistory. His work has been criticized for flawed methodology, ignoring archaeological and historical evidence, and mistranslations of ancient texts, as well as for incorrect astronomical and scientific claims. American biblical scholar Michael S. Heiser states he has found many inaccuracies in Sitchin's translations and challenges interested parties to use this book to check their validity. Professor Ronald H. Fritz, author of the book Invented Knowledge, False History, Fake Science, and Pseudo-Religions, mentions the example of Sitchin's claim that the Sumerian sign, whatever this is, means pure ones of the blazing rockets, adding that Sitchin's assignment of meanings to ancient words is tendentious, which basically means you're trying to make it controversial, and frequently strained. Fritz also commented on Sitchin's methodology, writing that when critics have checked Sitchin's references, they have found that he frequently quotes out of context or truncates, which means basically like to shorten his quotes in a way that distorts evidence in order to prove his evidence is presented selectively and contradictory evidence is ignored. Sitchin bases his arguments on his personal interpretations of Egyptian and Sumerian texts. In the seal VA-243, Sitchin wrote that these ancient civilizations knew of a 12th planet when in fact they only knew of 5. Hundreds of Sumerian astronomical seals and calendars have been decoded and recorded, and the total count of planets on each seal has been 5. Seal VA-243 has 12 dots that Sitchin identifies as planets. When translated, seal VA-243 reads, "You're his servant," which is now thought to be a message from a nobleman to a servant. According to Heiser, the so-called sun on the seal VA-243 is not the Sumerian symbol for the sun, but is a star, and the dots are also stars. The symbols on seal VA-243 has no resemblance to the hundreds of documented Sumerian sun symbols. Okay, real quick. This is, seal VA-243. You guys have seen this before when you've seen Sitchin showing this. Now, the whole thing with this is, he wants to say that, you have the sun in the middle, which us today will look at it and say, yeah, that's the sun, and that's planets around it. Now, they're telling you from everything they found with the Sumerians. And this is another thing you got to understand. Like, there is about, you can count them on one hand. There's about 3 or 4 people on the planet, the entire world, that can read Sumerian. And it takes so much to do it. Sitchin is supposedly self-taught. Any one of those people who can actually read ancient Sumerian, I tell you, he don't know a lick. He don't know what he's talking about. He don't understand. They're all on video. A lot of them came out and spoke about this, and I just read some of the stuff that they had to say. But the man is bonkers when it comes to a lot of the stuff. But the seal will get most people, because you'll look at it and you'll see clear as day, that looks like the sun. What else could it be? And, they're telling you everything that they found as far as the symbols for the sun, that's not it when you have these dots around it. Something completely different. So what we know, you got to understand, everything in the ancient world, when we're talking about the Bible, everything that's in the Old Testament, as I said before, is dealing with Saturn. Saturn as being the primary sun, plain and simple. And this is what it's talking about. So the Sumerians exclusively dealt with Saturn, plain and simple. They dealt with Saturn. So even when you go into the Bible, when it's talking about Remphian, as I showed you guys before, even in the book of Acts, and you got to think about the Old Testament, the gods that they was worshiping, Moloch, the bull calf god, and Baal, all of it has to go back to Saturn, plain and simple. So this is really this. Now, when you see it, it makes more sense. That's Saturn in the middle. And then he said, what I just read, that those are not planets, those are stars. So what do you see that is showing you around Saturn is constellations, which would be stars. It's not our sun. So when you look at the ancient symbols, I showed you guys these before, you can clearly see 3, figures. You got sun, you got a moon, and you have another sun. As I talked about before, we had 2 suns. Every ancient civilization that's ancient is talking about this. This is what they depicted. We have even older references showing 2 suns and the moon. So you even have it before when it's just 2 suns. And you have ancient civilizations referring to a time where there wasn't no moon, and the moon just, came out of nowhere. This is why you had the book Who Built the Moon. It's really weird. So as you've seen in the story, that, Earth, supposedly a satellite or a moon of Saturn. And this was during human time when people could actually see this, and something happened. Now, that something that happened to me is what caused this, this fall of man, they would say, or this, whatever caused man to go in hiding or go underground or go wherever we went when this catastrophe obviously happened. So everything changed for whatever reason. So this is kind of sort of where history picks up on. So if you take it back to Genesis and you see that, okay, it's really talking about, the fall, Saturn falling as a sun, Jupiter being God. I showed you guys all this about Jupiter being God and everything like that. And then we have this beginning of civilization, which Genesis, not realizing that, it was civilizations before us, kind of sort of hinting, in a esoteric way to Genesis 1, where you have people that was created before Adam and Eve. And that's esoteric as well, as I got into. But it kind of works both ways. But you got to look at that. So what you have with the Sumerian Empire, this connection with Saturn, and we see it. And same thing as we go up. So we got to realize that a lot of these beings they're talking about is representing Saturn, has to deal with this stuff. So Old Testament, it's all Saturn worship. Just that simple. And then you start putting together with the Old Testament being Jewish, with the Jews, talked about this. And you have, the black robes, the square of Saturn, the tefillin that they wear, all the stuff goes back to Saturn, all that stuff. So, if Saturn is Satan, and then we have the evil God of the Old Testament, and everybody swears this, Satan was God. He was evil Old Testament. Something was wrong with God back then. And then we have Jesus in the New Testament representing the sun we see today, which, Saturn will be the dark sun, they call it, the black sun. This is what they want to hide from us. So the truth, when we start really getting into the Sumerian Empire, ancient Sumeria, this is what we're going to find. You're going to find black-faced people. black people. And then one of the main things that they got into that we see the most talking about with the Sumerians is them talking about beings coming down. Now, Sitchin, if you follow, this whole Anunnaki thing, he's saying that, that the Bible comes from Sumeria. It's one of the things he's saying that the Nephilim, the Nephilim is basically the Anunnaki. He's trying to make the Anunnaki the Nephilim in the Old Testament. And that, the Bible basically comes from Sumeria, which, this is one of the things. Whenever people say stuff like that, like, I only agree with the Old Testament, New Testament is bad. Or, oh no, Jesus was black, they changed it. They didn't want to put it in there. They took out all the black stuff out the Bible. Or they say anything derogatory about the Bible. This wasn't in there. They changed this and that. But then they still believe in the book, which don't make sense. So you believe that they went in there to change something in the Bible to deceive you. Why would you believe the rest of the book? That tarnishes the whole book. Oh, they took out something that they didn't want there to deceive you, but they gave you the truth because they want you to have the truth. If they wanted you to have the truth, they would have left it in there in the first place, or they wouldn't change anything at all. So why would you believe anything in the book? So when people say, hey, this is where the stuff really comes from, why would you still believe it? So you have a lot of black people that's like, okay, well, we believe that they took stuff from Egypt, but the rest of it was good. Or we believe that the book was used for good, but just by bad people. But then they believe all the hocus pocus stuff that's in the book. And they believe that God got them a car, God saved their life, God got them off drugs and everything like that. But God didn't do anything to punish the people that used the book for evil during slavery. Nothing got done to them. So they got rich. They bloodlines got stinking rich off of us. So you pick your poison, but it's one of those things.